He doesn't raise his voice, doesn't throw a tantrum, doesn't do the cable news snarling thing either. Just drops a line that lands heavy. He's here to show Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is the biggest fraud Congress has ever seen. The room doesn't erupt. It doesn't gasp. It just goes still. The kind of still that makes you notice the buzz of cameras and the way staffers stop blinking. And then, right on cue, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez laughs. Not the awkward laugh you make when you're cornered, but the curated one you can practically see being rehearsed for clips. If you've watched politics long enough, you know that laugh is a tool. The same way a gavel is a tool, and it's designed to make the other person look small. She leans into her microphone like she's already cutting the highlight reel. Blazer catching the overhead lights at exactly the right angle. Because of course it does. She talks like she's auditioning for the next viral montage. The podcast bro, the failed cop, the predictable pitch about gold coins and apocalypse food, all delivered with perfect timing. Her side of the dais chuckles, staffers pull out phones, and you can almost hear someone thinking, "Great, we've got tonight's clip." It's the kind of moment that plays well on social feeds, the kind that's supposed to end the argument without ever touching the substance. And the strangest part is how familiar it all feels, like politics has become a sport where nobody keeps score except the algorithm in everyone's pocket. Bongino doesn't flinch, doesn't grin, doesn't bite, just sits there with hands folded like a man who has waited out longer, darker silences than this. That's what throws her off, at least in this version of events, because performers feed on reaction the way a campfire feeds on dry wood. The laughter fades, and her smile twitches, just a fraction, as if she's realizing she can't steer him with mockery. He finally asks, flat as asphalt, "You finished?" And it isn't macho, it's administrative, like he's closing a meeting. She shoots back that she's just getting started, tries to turn it into a swagger contest, but the room can feel the rhythm shifting. Then he reaches down and opens a briefcase that looks more workhorse than prop. Worn leather, no showy hardware, no dramatic flourish. Out comes a single manila folder. Nothing thick, nothing cinematic. The kind of thing you'd see in a municipal office, except it's placed so every camera can read the label. The label, in big, plain type, is a punchline without a joke. Ocasio-Cortez, the fraud. And whether you think that's fair or cheap or theatrical, you can't deny it's a visual that was built to travel. He doesn't argue about her tweets or her tone first. He starts with money, the way people always do when the gloves come off. He says a number, $47 million, and lets it hang there. The way a preacher lets a word hang before the congregation decides whether to breathe again. He frames it as a flow, a river of donor cash moving through a maze of entities. The kind of maze that makes normal people's eyes glaze over until you translate it into plain English. In his telling, it's PACs and LLCs and consulting invoices, arrows pointing in circles like a child's drawing of a tornado. He talks as if every transfer has a footprint, every payment a breadcrumb, and he's claiming he brought the whole trail. And at that point, the hearing stops feeling like a sparring match and starts feeling like someone announcing they've got receipts and they're not here to be liked. But before he dives into the weeds, he pulls back and says, essentially, let's start simple. How you live, what you choose, what you signal when you think no one's grading you. That's where the political irony always lives, in the gap between what a person preaches and what a person purchases. He produces what he calls a lease agreement and points to a luxury apartment in Navy Yard, Washington, D.C., at $3,500 a month, complete with the amenities you'd expect to see in a lifestyle ad. Now, could that be typical for D.C.? Sure, and members of Congress do live between two worlds, one in the district and one near the Capitol. But his point isn't that she's forbidden from comfort. It's that she sells herself as the patron saint of people who can't afford it. He doesn't say, "You're guilty." He says, "Explain the contradiction." And that's a different kind of knife. He lays out a list, again in his narrative, of cheaper apartments within walking distance, places without rooftop pools and concierge desks, the kind of buildings where the elevator smells like somebody's takeout. It's a rhetorical trap because it forces a simple question. If you're building a brand on solidarity with the squeezed, why do your personal choices read like you're trying to escape the squeeze? AOC fires back that it's normal, that it's the cost of doing the job. And she's not wrong that D.C. is expensive in the way only D.C. can be. But he keeps returning to that word, choice, like he's saying the issue isn't the rent, it's the message. Then he pivots to her signature climate messaging, the stuff that turned her into a national headline machine. And he treats it like a contract she wrote with her own mouth. If you tell people the house is on fire, you don't get to stroll out with a marshmallow and say you're just networking. He claims to have records of dozens of flights, first class or business class, and he frames it as the kind of carbon footprint math that makes regular folks feel like they're being lectured by someone in a leather seat. Is that a fair way to judge a member of Congress who travels for work? Maybe, maybe not. And that's why it works. It makes the audience argue with itself. The subtext is brutal, though. If sacrifice is the sermon, why does the preacher always fly premium? AOC tries the obvious defense, that travel is official business, that her work requires her to be where she's needed, and in a functioning democracy, that's a legitimate claim. But he's not arguing the necessity of travel. He's arguing the symbolism of indulgence, because American politics runs on symbolism like cars run on gasoline. He holds up what he describes as a photo from Miami Beach during a brutal winter stretch, and the room's mood changes the way it changes when someone brings out an old yearbook picture you didn't want shown. He paints it as a fundraiser, a beach mansion, a champagne vibe, and whether every detail is accurate or not, the image does what images always do. It tells a story faster than a paragraph can. And the story it tells is that there are two AOCs, the one on the beach and the one on the timeline, switching costumes in between posts. She says it was scheduled. She says it's being twisted. She says the context matters, and context does matter, especially when politics lives on selective clips. But he cuts her off because he's pacing this like a prosecutor in a courtroom drama, and the pace is part of the persuasion. He moves on to policing, the slogan fights, the debate that turns into a war of definitions. What does defund mean? What does reimagine mean? What does abolish mean? And who gets hurt if you guess wrong? He frames it as another contradiction, producing what he claims are disclosure documents about her security spending, implying she lives under a protection umbrella she doesn't want other people to have. And here's where the argument turns uncomfortable, because even if you dislike the politics, you can still understand why a high-profile figure might want security. So the question becomes, do you get to outsource safety while lecturing everyone else about doing without it? She says she receives threats, and that's believable, because public life is not a gentle place in America anymore. He responds by broadening the lens, asking whether the cashier closing a bodega late at night gets to higher protection, whether an elderly man walking home gets a private detail, whether a kid in a rough neighborhood gets an escort. It's not an accusation as much as a moral equation, and moral equations are what this country argues about when it can't agree on facts. The room in this story goes quiet, not because everyone agrees, but because everyone recognizes the discomfort of being asked to weigh one person's fear against another person's vulnerability. Even the people who dislike Bongino can hear the rhetorical hook. Safety becomes a luxury when it's privatized. Then he turns the spotlight inward, toward her own office, the people who work for her, the idealistic young staffers who show up believing they're joining a movement. He claims to read from ethics-related complaints, anonymous or sworn, describing unpaid overtime, high-pressure demands, the kind of workplace stories that sound eerily similar whether the boss is progressive, conservative, corporate, or nonprofit. And that's the nasty little truth. Everybody loves workers' rights until they're the one managing the schedule. AOC objects that anonymous complaints are easy to file and hard to prove, and she's right, which is why the careful phrasing matters. He doesn't say proven, he says on record, filed, reported. He paints the image of a public champion of labor who, behind the scenes, might treat labor like a disposable resource, and he lets the audience decide whether that feels plausible. At this point, the folder feels less like paperwork and more like a mirror being held up to a political brand, and brands hate mirrors. He even concedes, in a way that sounds almost casual, that hypocrisy isn't always a crime, that sometimes it's just ugly, sometimes it's just disappointing, sometimes it's just what happens when slogans become careers. But then he flips to the next tab, and he changes his tone just enough that you notice it, like a driver easing off the radio before a hard conversation. He says this next part is where it stops being about optics and starts being about numbers, systems, and how the money moved. And those words land like a cold draft. And if you've been watching politics long enough, you know that's the pivot. The moment the theater edges towards something that could ruin people, whether it's true, half-true, exaggerated, or simply weaponized. He begins sketching out what he calls a web. Brand new Congress, Justice Democrats, Courage to Change. Names that sound righteous on a t-shirt, but, in the wrong story, can sound like labels on a shell game. He frames it as donors giving small amounts, people believing they're supporting a cause, then watching those dollars bounce from entity to entity until accountability gets blurry. AOC tries to brush it off as routine political infrastructure, and plenty of political infrastructure is routine, which is exactly why it's so easy to hide a needle in that haystack. He mentions consultants, internal allies, and the kind of vague invoice language, services, operations, strategic support that can mean anything from legitimate work to perfectly legal nonsense. And he stops right there, right on the edge, with the kind of pause that tells you the next page is either a turning point or a cliffhanger, depending on what you believe about the people holding the folder. He doesn't say the system is illegal, at least not out loud, but he talks about it the way someone talks about a house with doors that never quite close. Money goes in, money moves around, money comes out somewhere else. And by the time anyone tries to follow it, the trail looks like spaghetti on a whiteboard. He calls it creative compliance, the kind of phrase that sounds harmless until you realize it exists precisely because plain compliance would raise questions. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez smirks at first, the way people do when they think the other side is bluffing. But the smirk doesn't last long, because the next thing he does is slow everything down and start naming people instead of structures. He brings up advisors, consultants, trusted allies, and frames them as a tight circle that's always orbiting the same center. In his telling, it's not a conspiracy. It's just how modern political ecosystems evolve when loyalty matters more than distance. He gestures at a chart that, if you squint, looks like a subway map designed by someone who hates commuters. Lines double back on themselves. Arrows point in directions that don't feel intuitive. and everything eventually loops back toward the same few stations. And he asks a question that hangs there longer than it should. At what point does complexity stop being a necessity and start being camouflage? AOC fires back that progressive movements rely on grassroots infrastructure, that consultants don't work for free, that organizing costs money. All of that is true, at least on paper, and the room knows it, which is why nobody claps. Bongino nods like he agrees, which is somehow worse, because agreement robs the argument of its heat. Then he says something like, "Let's get specific," and specificity is always dangerous in a place built on generalities. He flips to a page and mentions payments to a romantic partner, framing it not as scandal, but as curiosity. The name lands differently because it isn't political. It's personal, and personal details hit harder even when they're not illegal. He asks what work was done, what deliverables exist, what emails or memos show outcomes tied to compensation. He doesn't say the answers don't exist. He says he couldn't find them, which is a subtle but crucial distinction. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says the work was real, that digital strategy isn't always visible, that not everything leaves a paper trail. That's also true, and the room can feel how messy reality is compared to the clean lines people want. But Bongino doesn't argue. He just returns to donors, the people who gave small amounts believing they were fueling a cause. He tells a story about a hypothetical supporter, someone juggling bills and shifts, someone who donated because hope felt cheaper than cynicism. He doesn't claim to speak for that person. He asks whether anyone in the room has considered how it feels to be them. It's a classic populist move, and even people who dislike populism recognize its power when it's aimed carefully. The question isn't whether the payments were legal, it's whether they align with the moral pitch that built the movement. By now, the hearing feels less like a trial and more like a slow, uncomfortable therapy session for American politics. Everyone is being forced to sit with contradictions they usually scroll past. AOC's posture changes again, not collapsing, but tightening, like someone bracing for a cold wave. Her attorney whispers she waves him off, and you can tell she's choosing to fight on narrative rather than detail. Narrative has always been her weapon, after all. Bongino pivots again, this time to imagery, and you can almost hear a collective groan from people who know what's coming. He talks about a border visit that turned into an iconic photograph, the kind that becomes a symbol whether it deserves to or not. He frames it carefully, acknowledging the emotional weight of the issue, the genuine suffering that exists regardless of politics. Then he asks how much of politics is about witnessing pain and how much is about capturing it. That question lands because nobody in the room wants to answer it honestly. He claims there were multiple photos that day, some emotional, some mundane, some smiling, some staged. He doesn't say the emotion was fake. He asks whether the camera changes how emotion is expressed. Anyone who's ever taken a selfie at a funeral knows the discomfort of that question. AOC says she was overwhelmed, that moments can shift, that grief doesn't follow a script. Again, that's true, which is why the accusation remains implied rather than stated. Then he introduces text messages, allegedly from staff, allegedly about optics, allegedly about timing. He reads them like someone reading stage directions rather than confessions. Make sure the photographers are ready, that kind of thing. The language of modern activism where awareness and exposure blur together. He doesn't call it manipulation. He calls it strategy and lets the audience decide whether that distinction matters. The discomfort deepens because most people know strategy when they see it, even if they don't like admitting it. He asks how often symbolic moments turn into fundraising moments, and whether that transformation cheapens the original cause. AOC says fundraising is how movements survive, that awareness without resources goes nowhere. That's not wrong, but it doesn't erase the queasy feeling that comes with monetized outrage. The room seems divided not along party lines, but along tolerance lines. How much performance is acceptable before authenticity cracks? Bongino doesn't press for an answer. He moves on like a man stacking unanswered questions into a pile. Next comes immigration rhetoric, the language used, the metaphors chosen, the historical comparisons that light fires faster than they solve problems. He mentions law enforcement injuries, not as proof of causation, but as a reminder that words ripple outward in unpredictable ways. He asks whether politicians should be responsible for the interpretations of their most extreme supporters. That question has haunted American politics for years, and nobody has found a satisfying answer. AOC pushes back, saying moral clarity requires strong language, that injustice demands urgency. Bongino counters by asking whether urgency excuses imprecision, and whether imprecision can get people hurt. It's not an accusation, it's a philosophical dilemma disguised as testimony. Then he does something almost cruel in its simplicity. He counts. He counts bills sponsored, visits made, follow-ups conducted, and frames the results as thin compared to the noise. Not non-existent, just thinner than the brand would suggest. This is where the hearing shifts from scandal to sadness, because it touches on something deeper than one politician. It touches on how often visibility substitutes for impact, how often attention replaces outcomes. He suggests that media presence became the work, not a means to it. AOC says awareness changes culture, and culture change leads policy. That's a defensible theory, but it's also a convenient one when policy stalls. Then he introduces donors again, this time larger ones, organizations with agendas, money flowing in once the spotlight grew brighter. He doesn't allege foreign control or criminal schemes. He asks about alignment and incentive. Who benefits when the narrative stays hot, but the solution stays vague? It's an uncomfortable question because it applies far beyond this room. AOC calls it insinuation, says it borders on character assassination. Bongino replies that insinuation is what happens when transparency is partial, not complete. He says full sunlight prevents shadows from being misread. The tension in the room feels less partisan now and more existential. This isn't about left versus right. It's about whether modern politics can survive its own marketing techniques. Even the cameras seem quieter, as if they're waiting to see which way the story tips. He pauses again, longer this time, and says the next part is about power rather than money. He talks about Amazon, Queens, jobs promised and jobs lost, narratives of victory and defeat that depend entirely on where you stand. He lays out the argument that stopping corporate expansion can look like justice or self-sabotage depending on the lens. AOC defends the decision as protecting communities from displacement and exploitation. That argument has merit, and many economists still debate it. But Bongino introduces a different angle, one that doesn't get discussed as often. He asks whether economic stagnation can be politically useful, whether a population struggling to stay afloat is easier to mobilize than one climbing the ladder. He frames it as a cynical question, not an accusation, but cynicism has a way of sticking. The room feels colder when he says it. He references an email, allegedly private, allegedly candid, and reads it slowly. The language, in his telling, suggests strategic thinking about voter composition rather than community prosperity. AOC reacts sharply, calling it misinterpretation, saying private messages aren't policy. That's true, but private messages often reveal priorities more honestly than press releases. Bongino lets that tension sit, unresolved, like a chord that never resolves to major or minor. He says this isn't about demonizing success or condemning ambition. It's about asking who benefits from perpetual struggle and who benefits from real improvement. He points out that stable, upwardly mobile voters are less predictable, less emotionally dependent. It's a theory many strategists quietly acknowledge and publicly deny, and hearing it spoken aloud makes people shift in their seats. As the session drags on, the mood shifts again, this time toward isolation. AOC looks around the dais, toward allies who suddenly find their notes fascinating. No one jumps in, no one offers a rescue line, no one reframes the debate. Politics teaches you early who's with you until the math changes. In this telling, the math has changed. Bongino notes statements released by colleagues that are technically supportive but emotionally distant. The kind of statements that say nothing while pretending to say something. He doesn't gloat, he observes, like someone describing weather patterns. Storms form when pressure drops, and pressure drops when risk rises. AOC seems to realize she's standing alone inside her own brand. When she finally speaks again, her voice is softer, less performative. She calls it persecution, calls it fear of progressive change, calls it coordinated resistance. Those lines have worked before, and there's no reason not to try them again. But they land differently now, not because they're false, but because they're familiar. Familiarity dulls even the sharpest slogans. Bongino listens, then says something almost gentle. He suggests that maybe none of this started with malice. Maybe it started with belief, momentum, attention, and the quiet assumption that the rules bend for people who matter. He says power rarely corrupts all at once. It corrodes slowly. And by the time you notice, the original mission feels distant and abstract. He closes his folder again, not because he's finished, but because he knows when to pause. The chairman clears his throat, procedural words spill out, and the hearing moves toward its next phase. No verdict is delivered, no handcuffs appear, no villain is formally named. What's left instead is a fog of questions, doubts, and narratives competing for dominance. And everyone in the room knows this story isn't over, because modern politics never ends cleanly. The chairman's voice recedes into procedure, but the echo of what's been said lingers longer than any gavel strike. People in the room start doing the mental math they always do after moments like this, calculating headlines, donor reactions, and which talking points will survive the night. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez gathers herself the way seasoned politicians do, spine-straightening, face settling into something composed enough to pass for calm. She knows, as everyone does, that hearings don't end careers by themselves. Narratives do that, slowly, across screens and conversations. The real audience isn't in the room at all. It's scattered across couches, kitchens, and phone screens, deciding what to believe. Bongino, for his part, doesn't linger in triumph because triumph is a dangerous look when facts are contested. He frames what he's done as presentation, not prosecution, a careful choice of words that gives him plausible restraint. In politics, saying "I showed" always plays safer than saying "I proved," and he seems acutely aware of that line. He repeats, almost to the point of redundancy, that questions remain open, investigations ongoing, conclusions premature. It sounds cautious, but it also keeps the spotlight exactly where he wants it. AOC tries to reclaim the narrative by appealing to motive rather than minutiae. She talks about why she entered politics, about being underestimated, about challenging systems that benefit from inertia. It's a familiar arc, one that has carried her through storms before, and it still resonates with people who see themselves reflected in it. She reminds the room that movements are messy, that change never comes in clean spreadsheets. But even as she speaks, the air has shifted, because the conversation is no longer just about ideals, it's about trust. Trust is the quiet currency of politics, harder to quantify than votes, and easier to lose than regain. You can survive being called radical, naive, even hypocritical. But surviving doubt from your own base is another matter entirely. The hearing doesn't declare her untrustworthy, but it introduces the idea that maybe, just maybe, the story is more complicated than the brand. And complexity is kryptonite for movements built on clarity and urgency. People can argue with ideology, they struggle with ambiguity. As cameras shut off and staffers start whispering, the post-game begins. Analysts will argue about whether Bongino crossed a line or simply walked along one that's been ignored for too long. Supporters will say the questions were loaded, the framing unfair, the tone hostile. Critics will say this is what scrutiny looks like when charisma stops deflecting it. Both sides will clip their favorite moments and pretend the rest didn't happen. Outside the building, the reaction fractures along predictable seams. Some people see a necessary challenge to a political celebrity who's been shielded by narrative momentum. Others see a coordinated attempt to undermine a woman who disrupts comfortable power structures. Most people, if they're honest, see pieces of both and don't know what to do with that discomfort. And discomfort, more than outrage, is what keeps stories alive. In places far from Washington, the hearing lands differently. It lands in break rooms and kitchens, in neighborhoods where politics feels abstract until it suddenly doesn't. People who once shared her clips with pride now rewatch them with narrowed eyes, searching for signals they missed. People who always disliked her feel vindicated, even if they can't articulate exactly why. And then there are those in between, the quiet majority who want to believe in something without feeling played. That's where the damage, if there is damage, becomes hardest to measure. Not in polling dips or cable segments, but in the subtle erosion of faith. When supporters start asking whether every impassioned speech is also a pitch, something fundamental shifts. Politics becomes transactional instead of aspirational, and cynicism creeps back in. Once cynicism sets in, it doesn't leave easily. Bongino does a single interview later, choosing his words with the care of someone who understands how easily confidence turns into arrogance. He says he isn't celebrating, that there's nothing joyful about watching belief collide with doubt. He frames the hearing as exposure, not punishment, an invitation to accountability rather than a verdict. That framing matters, because it allows him to appear reluctant, almost burdened by what he's brought forward. Reluctance is persuasive in a culture tired of performative certainty. He talks about patterns rather than people, systems rather than personalities. The suggestion is that this story could apply to almost anyone who rises fast and learns the wrong lessons early. Fame, he implies, is a solvent that dissolves boundaries unless someone actively reinforces them. That idea resonates because it doesn't require villains, just incentives. And incentives shape behavior more reliably than character tests ever have. Meanwhile, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez retreats into strategy mode. Her statements become tighter, more legalistic, less lyrical than her earlier rhetoric. She emphasizes process, due diligence, and the dangers of drawing conclusions from incomplete information. It's a shift that signals awareness, maybe even vulnerability, without admitting fault. Whether that shift reads as growth or retreat depends on who's watching. Some of her colleagues distance themselves subtly, the way politicians always do when uncertainty creeps in. They issue statements that express concern without commitment, solidarity without specificity. No one wants to be caught defending something that later looks indefensible. It's not cowardice so much as survival instinct, honed over years of watching careers implode. Still, isolation is a lonely teacher. The hearing doesn't answer the central question everyone is thinking, and maybe that's why it works. Is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez a symbol of authentic change struggling under impossible scrutiny, or a case study in how branding overtakes belief? The truth, as usual, is probably messier than either camp wants to admit. People are rarely one thing, especially when millions project their hopes onto them. And projection is a heavy burden to carry without distortion. As days pass, the clips keep circulating, each one stripped of context and reassembled into arguments. The phrase, "questions remain," becomes both shield and sword. Supporters repeat it to fend off conclusions. Critics repeat it to justify suspicion. The story refuses to settle because settling would require consensus, and consensus is a dying art. In its place, we get endless debate. Some observers note that nothing in the hearing, taken alone, definitively proves wrongdoing. Others point out that politics has never required proof to demand accountability. What it requires is plausibility, repetition, and a narrative that fits what people already suspect. Once that narrative exists, facts become supporting actors rather than leads. That's not new, but it's still unsettling to watch. There's also the uncomfortable realization that many of the criticisms leveled at her could apply broadly. The revolving door between activism and consulting, the monetization of outrage, the careful cultivation of image. If this is disqualifying, then the field narrows dramatically. If it isn't, then why does it sting so much when aimed at someone who promised to be different? That question lingers longer than any allegation. In quiet moments, even some critics admit they wanted her to succeed. They wanted proof that idealism could survive contact with power. They wanted a counterexample to the idea that everyone eventually plays the same game. Disappointment, when it comes, hurts more than anger ever could. And disappointment is what fuels the longest arguments. The story doesn't end with a resignation or a vindication, at least not yet. It ends in a gray zone, where people reassess what they expect from leaders. Should politicians be saints, or just less cynical than average? Is it fair to demand purity in a system designed to reward compromise and performance? And if the answer is no, what exactly are voters supposed to believe in? What this hearing ultimately exposes, more than any individual, is the fragility of modern political trust. We build heroes quickly and dismantle them just as fast, often using the same tools. Social media amplifies certainty while shrinking patience, leaving little room for nuance. In that environment, even sincere efforts can start to look calculated. And calculated behavior, once suspected, is nearly impossible to disprove. As the news cycle churns, new stories will compete for attention, and this one will slide down the feed. But the questions it raises won't disappear, because they're not really about one congresswoman or one commentator. They're about how power, money, and image intersect in a culture obsessed with visibility. They're about whether movements can stay honest once they learn how to win. And they're about whether voters can ever fully trust the people who speak most passionately in their name.